Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight Bree and I are talking with Dapper Dinosaur. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey!
Hello.
Well,
It's about time we
so
made this happen. We got Dapper Dinosaur on the
I
show.
I know we're moving up in the world, aren't we?
Right. Getting
Well,
those
first of all, I want to say thank you to Bree because I know that you had a rough day today. You had a lot going on, and you still are my right hand. So thank you.
Yep. And I got a surprise. I just want to show everybody we're gonna have painted lady butterflies in the hive. So
Nice.
stay tuned for that. It's gonna be awesome. All right. So we invited Dapper here today to talk about we've talked about evolution like a lot on this channel, but there's a branch of evolution that we really haven't ever got to dive into, and I think Dapper is just the person to help us dive into that. It's called speculative evolution, and I'm glad that they're here to kind of guide us on the way because they have a whole Discord server dedicated to it.
I do, yeah.
All right,
It's actually fairly active too.
Yeah. Do you want to explain to our audience here what speculative evolution is?
Yeah. So, speculative evolution, it's connected to speculative fiction overall, right? So there's this idea in speculative fiction, like fantasy and sci-fi, about what if the world were just different? And speculative evolution looks at what would biology be like under different circumstances. So, for instance, maybe on a hypothetical island on Earth where you have different organisms that colonize the island from nearby like continental land masses, and you have a thought experiment or an art project or something. Or you could go farther afield and you could do something like, well, what if one of the major extinction events on Earth just didn't happen? And so we have, like, say, one common one is like the KPG extinction that killed off most of the dinosaurs. I mean, most of the everything, really. What if that didn't happen? So, like, the megafauna on Earth right now, 66 million years later, are still, dinosaurs, and there's still ornithischians running around, and the non-avian theropods are still hunting big game and whatnot. But you can also take it even farther afield and say things like, okay, well, what if we look at life on another planet, how that might evolve? And so this actually has a fairly long history. I mean, to some extent, you can even think of the Time Machine by H.G. Wells as containing some speculative evolution. He thinks about what might happen if the social divides of his day actually ended up becoming biological divides in the far future, and then humans split into at least two different species. And then he goes even farther and looks into what about the far future when the sun is nearing the end of its life and the habitability of Earth is almost over. What might that ecosystem look like? And it continues all the way down to today. And yes, as Beach Price asks, does it include silica-based? Yeah, sure. The only real requirement for it to be speculative evolution is that, one, it be speculative, and that, two, you are using things that can evolve. So
is the Borg speculative evolution?
So that might come
Asking
closer
the hard
to like
questions.
Yeah, so the Borg from Star Trek are probably closer to like dystopian versions of transhumanism, because it's not so much about biological evolution, which is usually what we mean when we say speculative evolution.
Okay, so the oldest speculative evolution I can think of is that comes to my mind. I mean, obviously you mentioned the Time Machine. I think of the Martians from War of the Worlds too, and their biology and how it related to the ideas that they had, at least about Mars at that time, and what its ecosystem, or I guess what you call it, a pseudo ecosystem, would be like.
Yeah.
Now, on your in your evolution stuff, you actually do some ecological modeling and things like that. There's actual science that can go into speculative evolution.
Yeah. So it's the degree to which you want to incorporate complexity is ultimately going to be up to taste if you're trying to start a speculative evolution project. So the more that you can include, the more realistic it can seem. But on the other hand, there's this kind of the feeling that, like, just like it would take you an entire lifetime to learn everything about any one ecosystem on Earth, you couldn't design a whole host of alien ecosystems in exacting detail. So to some extent, you do have to wave some things away. So, most evolutionary biology projects will wave away things like, bacterial type life. We'll just say, there's nitrogen fixing bacteria here and there, and they do all the normal stuff, and we'll just kind of continue on and not worry about it. Because most people, let's face it, are interested in big organisms. No one goes to, speculative evolution to learn about, like, how many different kinds of bacteria would evolve on Mars. Like, bacteria are cool and they're very important, but they're just not very charismatic. So, but yeah, and in fact, actually, one of the earliest works that you can get to in speculative evolution is one of the first really intentional projects that is primarily about the evolution and biology of the speculative group, is what's called the Rhinograded, I'm going to try and say it, Rhinogradentia, which are also called the Snouters, which was a mock biology report of this fictitious island by Gerolf Steiner. And so he has this group of mammals that evolve on this isolated island that, according to him, no longer exists. And this monograph that he's published is the only work left on them. But they're unusual for having this particular novel feature on their nose that allows them to use their nose as a locomotory organ. And so they walk on their noses, and some of them hop around on their noses, and they use their noses for prey acquisition. And he has this whole evolutionary tree and this ecosystem all designed for these snouter mammals. And that was really one of the first times that speculative evolution really took center stage in a work of fiction. Because, like Bre said with War of the Worlds, or like I mentioned with The Time Machine, it's there in the background, but clearly the human story of what's happening to the main characters is the real focus. And that's sort of the backdrop for the drama that the characters undergo. Whereas in the Snouters book, I mean, it's just about the biology. And so there is sort of a distinction where we get, there's some speculative evolution projects that are mostly just in service to some other work. And that is all background information, which is great to have. But then there are also projects that you can find, especially on YouTube, but also in books, where the speculative evolution really is the core of the whole idea. So, for instance, most people have seen the movie Avatar with the blue cat people. And there's a lot of speculative evolution in the background of that, including how do you get blue cat people out of those weird six-limbed, four-eyed creatures that breathe through their shoulders, which some of it's a bit far-fetched, but at least there's an attempt, right? Because of course,
well, there is because they show the gibbon looking ones, and they have sort of their arms are starting to fuse. So
exactly,
yeah.
That's an attempt and an indication as to how this sort of transition takes place. Because I mean, let's face it. Quite frankly, the design of the aliens in the movie, like the actual intelligent Na'vi, I mean, they're mostly just intended to be sexy, and so like any sense of how they fit in with the rest of the biology of the moon is just sort of like, well, we'll take nods to it. But when you look at the other organisms, right, they have some consistency. They all seem to have the same basic body plan, where you have these 6 limbs with 2 towards the front being generally paired together, 2 towards the back. Sorry, 2 pairs towards the front, 1 pair towards the back. They have the same respiratory organs. They all have a very similar set of these extensions of their nervous system that comes out through the top of their heads. And you can even see it when you see some of the underwater creatures. There's some creatures that still seem to have these 6 paired fins that correspond to the 6 limbs of the vertebrate-like animals.
About spoilers, though, Dapper.
Well, I actually haven't seen the new one. I've only seen the trailers, so I can't spoil anything that wasn't already in the trailers.
Okay, good. I just don't want to. I wasn't sure if they do any deeper exploration that I haven't got to see yet. So
I don't know either. They might, but also that's not the only project that has done things like this. Anytime you see an alien environment where there's some consistency in what's going on with the biology of the aliens, chances are someone at least thought about an evolutionary history. So, yeah. And
I get what you're saying there. Like, yeah, the silicon-based aliens from the Alien franchise definitely come to mind when you mention someone thinking about how they. Of course, we got multiple origins for that at this point. So,
Yeah, the Alien franchise is a little bit muddled in terms of the origins of its creatures. They might be bioengineered, maybe, but maybe not. It's a
yeah,
little confusing.
it's a mess.
But
Thanks a lot.
yeah, well, apparently there's even
But-
another movie coming out for that franchise. So
yeah,
I don't even know.
we'll see where it goes. So things like the color of the star and things like that, do those come into play when you're doing a speculative evolution? I know
They
that
They certainly do if you're doing speculative evolution on a different planet. If it's on Earth, then you're going to assume the sun is the sun. But so one of the really important ways in which it can come into play is that on Earth at least, planets actually reflect the brightest part of the sun's spectrum, and they absorb a broad range of other parts of the sun's spectrum. The sun is actually brightest in the green part of the spectrum, but you don't see it as green because it's also very bright in all the other parts of the visible spectrum. So it comes across as white. But also there's an alternate strategy that some photosynthetic organisms on Earth do, which is that they absorb green light and they reflect many other colors of light. So you have these two different strategies that photosynthetic organisms on Earth take in, which is either reflecting the maximum brightness to avoid damage while taking in the other nearby spectral, parts of the spectrum, or focus on that really high energy part. And so if you have a star of a different color, which means it's going to have a different peak part of its spectrum, then what color will either be reflected or maximally absorbed by the planets will itself tend to shift. Also, if you get dimmer and dimmer, it becomes less and less more important to specify which part of the spectrum a photosynthetic organism is going to absorb most. And instead, it starts to make more sense to just absorb as much as possible. So on, say, a cool reddish star, you might find photosynthetic organisms that are just pitch black because that absorbs as much of the light as possible. And they don't give any of it out because they need as much of it as they can get because the star is already dim. So there's things like that. Also, it can affect things like radiation. So for instance, let's say you have a star that's very radioactive. So either it's fairly big and bright, so it's just shining a lot of high energy photons out, or maybe it's one of the relatively cool stars that also tend to give off a lot of charged particles and that you have to be in close proximity to get good temperatures. Well, maybe that would determine things like what can live above the water, because the water is going to provide a lot of shielding, but once you get onto land, do you have to grow big mineralized shells to protect you from radiation? Do you have to hang out in caves? Do you even come out of the water at any time other than at night? Or maybe terrestrial organisms hide during the day and only come out of caves and shelters and from underneath rocks during the night. So there are essentially no terrestrial diurnal organisms on that kind of a planet. And so all of that can factor in. And one of the things that you'll see in a lot of projects is they'll tweak something significant, but then a lot of it the rest of it just ends up being sort of we just kind of assume Earth. And the reason for that is that it's easier, right? So if you want to say, okay, I want to do a speculative evolution project on a high gravity world where the surface gravity is 2.3 Gs, right? And that's 2.33 times stronger than Earth. Well, okay, it's going to cause some complexities. If you want to get really into it, you're going to have to look in things like what's the compressive strength of different chemicals that you could build bones out of, and what's the kinetic energy that something would gain when falling from a certain height, and what kinds of animals could or couldn't survive that, which tells you how high animals would be comfortable climbing without just risking their lives, and it's going to be not very high. So there's a lot of stuff that you can get into like that, like how high could a mountain actually get on a high G world? Turns out it's going to be lower. But then on the other hand, do you also want to deal with the complexities of saying, okay, well, there's also going to be a significantly different stellar spectrum. So I'm also going to have to work on the differences in biochemistry versus photosynthesis and what color everything should be. Maybe you don't want to do. Maybe that's too much. So a lot of projects will say things like, oh, this is a high G world. But then you look into it and well, everything else is going to be Earth-like though. Or this is a planet around a red dwarf star and it is only really habitable around this sort of not circumpolar, but like going around the edges. There's this twilight zone because the planet's going to be tidally locked. But then it's going to be basically Earth standard gravity and a very Earth-like atmosphere. So, and if someone out there is looking to start their own speculative evolution project, I would suggest doing basically the same thing. Make most things Earth-like, tweak something significantly, and see what kinds of outcomes that seems to present to you. And then maybe if you want to do a second or a third or subsequent, maybe then start changing some extra stuff, because it's already enough of a headache to think out through all the implications of one major change, never mind a whole bunch of them. So for instance, if we bring it back to Avatar, because it's one of the most popular things in recent memory with a lot of speculative evolution, one of the big things they changed was that the atmosphere is a lot thicker because of the presence of more noble gases in the atmosphere, which allows creatures to fly more easily, because while the gravity is somewhat lower than on Earth, the atmospheric pressure is so much higher, and therefore it takes less energy to stay aloft. You can generate more lift for a given wing surface. So there's a lot of flying creatures in the world. And so that could be something that you tweak.
Fascinating. I guess we should, at this point, maybe bring up Dougal Dixon, because you can't really talk about speculative evolution without covering the king of speculative evolution.
Yeah, Dougal Dixon and Wayne Barlow really are the two big names. More recently, C.M. Cozeman has been entering the fray, and there's also Nemo Ramjet, but they're much more recent. So Dougal Dixon, he's famous for a few different works, which are all somewhat surreal. So probably his first famous work that most people might have encountered is The New Dinosaurs, an alternate evolution, which is one of those things that I mentioned, whereas you can say like, okay, it's Earth, and the but is the KPG extinction didn't happen. So there was no asteroid that slammed to the Yucatan. And so Dougal Dixon is creating this world of modern non-avian dinosaurs. So he has, ceratopsians still roaming around in Alaska and whatnot. The descendants of Tyrannosaurus Rex are stomping around, eating ornithopods and things like that. And Titan Uranus also asked a question I want to answer real quick. Yeah, different chemistries can also be a really interesting thing to explore. So, for instance, you could do something like, say, have a high sulfur world. And so chemosynthesis, which usually on Earth at least involves breaking up sulfur compounds, might be more prevalent. And so you'd have a whole group of major organisms that, rather than doing photosynthesis, are relying on chemosynthesis as a result of this higher prevalence of, say, sulfur. That's just one example. But back to Dougal Dixon. So he also famously wrote After Man, which was his next big thing, which I think is probably... It probably gets more attention now than The New Dinosaurs did, because it includes things like the terrestrial predatory bat and like T-Rex looking baboons and rabbits that look like deer and rats the size of wolverines and wolves that go hunting things and penguins that have become almost fully aquatic. So it's full of really cool stuff like that.
I grew up with that book. Yes, The penguins were like whales. This is this future version of the way the world was going to look. If all these things fell in place, it's really just I guess you consider it almost an example of the butterfly effect, what the future could be if all this stuff falls in order.
Well, I want to ask a quick question. I'm just sitting back because I don't know a lot about this, and so I just want y'all to know that's why I'm kind of just quiet. It's very interesting, and I really like watching Bre get very into it, because you can just see she's like, oh my gosh, and I love watching that. But I do have a question. So when we're thinking about like theoretical evolution, is there some real world way that can benefit us? I mean, by thinking about what is theoretical, can that help us with our current, with our real states?
So there is, in some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. So to some extent, this is mostly a fun fictional project that can help people think about things like biology and evolution and how life could adapt to unusual circumstances. And there's some benefit to that.
It's like a teaching tool.
Right. On the other hand, though, it can also do things like suggest areas of research. Like, for instance, if someone can come up with a plausible biological way to exist in a particular environment where we might think life would be scarce, that could present itself as a new avenue for research. So, like, well, maybe we should check in places like this to see if there's life. So, for instance, the general consensus is, that the biosphere stops at a certain depth under the Earth. Well, if someone can come up with a really good way that, say, bacteria or something could survive below that depth, and that seems like a plausible, like a chemically and biologically plausible way of life, maybe that's good reason to check. Of course, digging really deep into the Earth is pretty expensive, so maybe not. But like, it can also suggest things like, should we check for life on, say, Europa, which is actually currently a thing that NASA is working on. NASA has currently funded I believe it's a Europa orbiter. It might just be a flyby. But they're looking to get funded a lander that would actually land on Europa and take samples and possibly even drill into the ice to see if they can find any examples of life. Now, this comes with a lot of problems about how to sterilize the lander itself so that we don't, one, contaminate Europa with Earth life, and two, so we don't mix up Earth life for Europa life. But until people started thinking about what other ways could life exist than it does on Earth, it was hard to understand how Europa, little cough, how Europa could harbor life. The sun is certainly not bright enough. It's intensely radioactive, at least on the surface. But when people started realizing, well, there's liquid water under the surface, because we can see cryovolcanoes, which are basically just ice geysers. There's geysers on the ice that shoot out liquid water. There are cracks on the surface where water has seemed to well up as a liquid. So there seems to be liquid water on Europa. Well, how else could it survive? And there are ideas about chemosynthesis as a result of the various actual regular volcanism that might be going on, taking molten material from the rocky core of the planet and spewing that into the water, forming the basis of a food chain. So that's, I think, one of the big ways in which speculative evolution can help push forward real science, is by suggesting new areas of research, which is a lot of what speculative fiction can do just generally. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so like, we use the same models, right? That we found, that we used to find Tiktaalik with, to predict what kind of organisms we'll find where.
Yeah, actually,
the same.
Yeah. That's actually surprisingly true. So when people are looking for specific intermediate forms in the fossil record, which is a thing people do all the time, you have to speculate based on what you already know as to what kinds of places you need to look. So, for instance, with Tiktaalik, there was it was pretty well established that stegocephalian fish had been the thing that gave rise to tetrapods, which is, all the land animals with 4 limbs that you can think of, as well as a few that don't have 4 limbs, like snakes, but that had lost those limbs. And so when Neil Shubin was trying to come up with a place to dig, he had to consider, okay, well, what kind of morphologies would I actually expect for a transition between a stegocephalian fish like Eosinopteron and a later pretty clearly tetrapodal animal like a Canthostega or something.
Yeah. And
so he said, well, okay, it seems like it would have the sort of intermediate fins that might be okay for scrambling on land, but it's certainly not going to get you to a full walk. So it has to be living in an area where there's a transition between aquatic and terrestrial environments. We know based on both molecular and outside fossil data that it has to be between this time and this time in terms of where in the geological column you should go. So we started looking around on a map for...
It has to be anaerobic too, because this species has to have developed a lung.
Well, so interestingly enough, it looks like lungs developed well before stegocephalian fish branched off from the rest of Rhipidistia. So it probably doesn't have to actually be super anoxic, because chances are that stegocephalian fish already had lungs even when they were in the open ocean, which is not terribly anoxic.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so, my mistake.
Hey, it happens. So Neil started looking for these swampy nearshore environments of the right age, and with exposed outcrops of rock, which is also important because if you can't get to the rock. But one of the things he had to do was he really did have to think about, well, how would it be likely that something that is very much fish-like its anatomy can get to something that's very much like sort of a big old salamander with teeth? And so he has to trace that through. And yeah, he found Tiktaalik. And a lot of those techniques are very similar to what speculative evolution uses.
That's so cool.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'd say this all the time. I'm a Lovelockian Gaianist or whatever, and that's based on the same kind of modeling stuff, like he was saying about the radiation from the sun. They use there's a Daisy World model that they use in that's very similar. But yeah, when it comes to the Dougal-Dixon kind of directions that things took, we got some series and some shows of mockumentaries, if you will, about speculative evolution as well, in the early 2000s. The Future is Wild is one that stood out for me, but did that inspire you to get into speculative evolution?
It's hard to say it was any one thing. I mean, speculative evolution, it comes with a lot of the things I find interesting generally, right? So, I'm interested in evolutionary biology. I'm interested in speculative fiction. I'm a giant nerd overall. So, but it's certainly in the mix there. And so for those of you who didn't see it, The Future is Wild had several episodes, each one stepping forward in time. I believe the first one started 5 million years in the future. And I think it goes all the way to like 100 million years in the future or something by the time the show is done. And
with the cephalopods taking over.
Right. So one of the important things to remember about speculative evolution is that it is in fact speculative. And so as you go through that show, the things that it's showing you become less and less likely and less certain, right? So how likely is it that there are going to be elephant-sized land squids that are parasitized by brain-controlling slime molds? I mean, not super likely. But is it impossible? Well, I can't say that. On the other hand, how likely is it that there will be in the salt flats that the Mediterranean becomes in a few million years, some descendants of modern wild pigs that run between fertile areas on that while being pursued by the descendants of modern like badgers or weasels or something? That sounds pretty plausible. That doesn't sound too crazy. Yeah, and
time scale matters,
right? So the closer we are to present when you're doing Earth speculative evolution, the more likely it is that what you're saying is plausible or even likely. So, for instance, with After Man, the idea of rabbits taking on the same niche as cervids or deer is actually not that implausible, right? They live in the same environments. Rabbits tend to do much better with humans than deer do because humans are much more likely to hunt deer to extinction than rabbits for a few reasons. One, deer just gives you more food. Two, deer take up a lot more space and a lot more resources. So when habitats become fractured by humans building houses and whatnot, rabbits can still do okay. Rabbits can even do okay in like semi-urban environments as long as there's patches of green space. They breed a lot faster. So overall, like, is it unreasonable to say that cervids might go extinct, whereas lagomorphs like rabbits would probably do just fine? No, that's not crazy. And then if there's an open niche for, like a medium to large size browser, there's no particular reason rabbits couldn't fill that. And similarly, when you have things like in Man After Man, you have the carnivorous pursuit predator rats. Well, rats already hunt in a small capacity, right? And they're also, again, one of those animals that's very likely to survive in a human-dominated world more or less indefinitely because they do great in human cities. So could they fill a sort of dog-like niche? Yeah, probably. Although I will also say the fact that it's not just dogs doing it, because, dogs do great in human cities too. And yeah, that one's a little odd to me. Like, dogs probably should have survived in Man After Man, but they didn't because he got rid of like almost all the carnivorans.
I think the only ones that last are the weasels, right?
There was also a arboreal cat that managed to somehow evolve to brachiate, which does seem pretty far-fetched.
Huh. Yeah, I remember that one. Dang. Arboreal brachiating cat.
Yeah, that was one of the ones where I was just like, I don't know. You're gonna have to make a whole lot of really quick modifications to that shoulder girdle in order to get a cat to brachiate. And they've already got claws that are great for hanging onto branches, so I don't see what pressures would lead to a brachiating cat. But you know.
Peter Jackson did a pretty good speculative evolution history for Skull Island. Skull Island's been done a couple of times, though.
Yeah, it has. So there's been a few, like many different depictions of Skull Island, right? So there's the one from the 50s movie, which is basically just an island full of dinosaurs. It's basically, you know, the Lost World or whatever. There's the Peter Jackson one, which has a much more careful setup of like how does the ecosystem function despite being absurdly dangerous in a way that islands tend not to be.
Right.
And then there's also been the Monsterverse depiction, which is similarly monstrous, but I feel like it's a little bit less careful in terms of its like ecology and the planning out of how the biology of the island functions.
It's a little more sillier, I think.
Yeah, having a like, you know, several story tall spiders with legs that look like bamboo stalks it's like that's a little bit far-fetched in a way a pit full of big worms isn't.
I did like the plant and animal symbiosis that they had in the Monsterverse one, though, that like kind of form of composite organisms. It was interesting direction.
It is interesting, and while we don't really have a lot of great plant animal hybrid or symbiotic organisms, we do have some algae animal symbiosis going on. So for instance, some sea slugs will actually consume algae, but rather than just digesting it directly for food, they'll actually pass it on to little fronds on their back, and then those algae will actually produce sugar via photosynthesis for the sea slug, which then gets free sugar by just having consumed some algae, and rather than digesting it, just using those algal cells. There are also some salamanders that rely on photosynthetic symbiotes in embryo. So while they're growing in an egg, rather than spending as much energy on producing a yolk, the mother will simply pass on some symbiotic. I mean, there's still a yolk, but there can be less of one because the mother salamander will pass on these symbiotic photosynthetic organisms that in the egg make the eggs actually look green. There's this green patch of eggs. It's because they're photosynthesizing, and that's how they're getting some of their energy to grow.
I hadn't heard of that. That's amazing.
Oh yeah. There's also lichen, or a symbiotic pairing of fungus and some kind of photosynthetic organism. Sometimes it's like a blue-green algae. Sometimes it's a red alga. It varies, right? And in an interesting twist of complexity, different photosynthetic species will be able to combine with more than one fungal species, and vice versa. So one fungal species will be able to have different kinds of photosynthetic symbionts in terms of lichen, which make lichen really complicated to classify because there's two species at least in each lichen, but the same fungal species can have two different photosynthetic symbionts in two different examples of that species of fungus, and the reverse. So like, do you classify them by both species? Do you take like the fungus as the primary thing and then put like in parentheses the other one if you need to? So lichens are really weird for that reason.
Yeah.
So there are actually real world examples of things like
what you see in Skull Island. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, not to the same horrifying extreme, but that's where the fictional dramatic parts come in. Because one of the things about Skull Island is you have to get over the conceit that it functions much more like a continent than an island in terms of both the size of organisms and how dangerous it is. Because overall, most oceanic islands, which is what Skull Island is portrayed as, are very light on predation and not very heavy on things that will kill you.
Yeah, it's hard to sustain a population in such of predator-prey relationships, right? And in such a closed quarter.
Well, like one thing that we see in the real world is island dwarfism. So we have examples both today and all through the geological column. So, for instance, there was a species of Paleoloxodon, which normally are some of the biggest proboscideans that have ever lived. Like the genus Paleoloxodon includes some of the largest elephant-like creatures ever, but also includes one species that was about the size of a pony and that lived on an island.
Yep.
But we also have dwarf sauropods from like Hateg Island, which is currently, I believe it's in where Hungary is now. But during that period of the Mesozoic, the Europe was basically just a bunch of little islands. So we have things like dwarf sauropods there. So on Skull Island, is it realistic to have not just full size, but like giant tyrannosaurs, bigger than T-Rex, along with gigantic apes the size of buildings? Well,
okay, I will say theropods in general on an island do tend to get bigger.
Well, so that's going to depend, though. So, for instance, you have the most extreme examples, right, are going to be the moa birds from like New Zealand. But New Zealand,
from Madagascar,
but those are big and continental islands.
That's true too. Madagascar and New Zealand are huge. I think some of the biggest islands in the world, right?
Right.
So you are absolutely right there.
When you look at theropods that got bigger on oceanic islands, like if you go to Mauritius to go look for the dodo, which got much larger than its pigeon ancestors, okay, but it was still not becoming a building-sized animal.
Yeah, I'm with you.
What tends to happen is very small animals can get bigger, and very big animals tend to get smaller. The small animals tend to get bigger because, generally speaking, they're not under the strong predation selection that keeps them relatively small and able to avoid predators. Big animals tend to get smaller because they're resource constrained. So rather than losing a selection pressure, they actually gain a new one, which is to say that it takes a lot of energy to grow to be really big. And there's only so much food on the island, and you also have to go and reproduce. So the short guys win.
In speculative evolution, is there a model that gives you is there a sweet spot of the biggest organism that you could make for a planet size? I'm just trying to think of the math that would have to go into that, because there's got to be the planet's gravity is going to come into effect on how big the organism can get based on the resources available for its structure, I guess.
So there's a few things you want to keep in mind. One is the effects of gravity. So higher gravity is going to restrict how big something can get, just because one, there's only so much compressive strength that any material has, right? So there's a gravity at which if you tried to stand upright in that gravity, your bones would just break. And that's going to be a higher gravity for you than it is for an elephant. You could probably do okay on like a planet with like 1.5 G's of gravity. It wouldn't be fun, but you could probably stand up. An elephant, on the other hand, might just crumple. It might just be done for an elephant. So you can do things like look at compressive forces and things like that. But even in circumstances where gravity isn't a big constraint, like say in the ocean or on a low gravity planet, there are also things you have to consider. For instance, it takes a noticeable amount of time for nerve impulses to travel from the brain to the body to enact some action, right? So even if gravity isn't a concern, if you want to make a 3-mile long organism, how can it possibly coordinate its bodily functions with a nervous system if it's going to be miles long? That brain signal is going to take minutes to travel down and minutes to travel back so it can react to any new stimulus.
Unless it has Wi-Fi.
Well, you also might be able to solve this problem with a distributed nervous system, like say a jellyfish, right? Jellyfish don't have a brain. Each part of them operates only in conjunction with its immediate neighbors. So you might be able to do something like that. But then also you have to ask the question, well, what's the point of being that big if you could also reproduce being smaller? And so on Earth, why do things tend to get big? Well, there's a few different reasons. One is avoiding predation. So for instance, adult elephants basically don't have predators except for humans. No, lions aren't going after adult elephants. They'll take on babies, sure. But once you get to be an adult elephant, other than humans, really nothing's coming after you. Another one is that it allows you to actually gather more food. This is one of the big reasons whales are so big. Because one of the things to remember is that while adult whales, like say humpback whales, now don't have any predators beyond humans, that was not the case not that long ago. There were in fact things that were big enough to eat whales. So they weren't avoiding predation by getting that big, but instead what you're finding is that with these mysticetes, which is the biggest whales, the baleen whales, it allows them to scoop up absurdly large amounts of krill, which is their main food source. So that's why they're so gigantic. So you can also use that in speculative evolution. But there's also other concerns, like anytime a cell divides in your body, there's a chance that some mutation will happen in one of the daughter cells that will make it cancerous. And there's also a chance that cancer cell may not be detected by your immune system because of some other mutation that just hides it, which is ultimately how cancer comes about, right? Organisms actually get cancer pretty frequently, but usually it does not come with enough mutations or the right mutations to make it so that your your immune system doesn't recognize it as unusual, which then terminates that cell. But the bigger you are, the more often that happens. In fact, big animals like elephants and whales have extra tumor suppressor genes to avoid this problem. But at a certain point, you can only have so many tumor suppressant genes and be so big, because eventually you're just going to be so big that you're just going to be a cancer factory.
So would end up with big big patches of cancer cells just growing out of control.
Yeah, which would presumably be fatal in the long run.
Yeah, it'd be just this big tumorous thing swimming through the seas. Gross.
Yep. I mean, it's not like this is a new thing, right? We have fossilized tumors. You can find dinosaur bones with tumors on them. So we know this is a thing that happens, especially to big animals. So there's that problem too. Now, if you go outside of animal-like things to plants or fungal networks, it becomes easier to get big. For instance, the biggest organisms on Earth are all plants or fungi. And that's because they have this distributed anatomy that is not centralized. They don't have a single set of lungs or a single digestive tract, right? They're spread out. So like with plants, you have trees that have multi-stems, but all have a shared root network. And the root network actually sends out runners that can eventually sprout new trunks. Well, you can cut down any one trunk and the whole system is fine. It doesn't need that one trunk, right? So with that kind of thing, you can go a little bit crazier where you have this distributed biology where no one part is vital and every part is performing multiple functions because of how it's set up, which you also got in what was it? I think it was called Life.
Oh yeah, Life.
Yeah, with Calvin, which was an alien that was found on Mars, and the thing with it was that every cell, according to the movie, was a neuron and a muscle and a photoreceptor. And now that level of distributed biology is a little bit far-fetched, but it does go to the same idea where you could get probably arbitrarily large with that kind of a setup. So if you want really big creatures, don't make them like animals, make them more like plants.
I think that's kind of what they did with Avatar too, is sort of made this network of all the organisms, and even the animals could connect into the plant network. And
interestingly, that's based on something on Earth. So on Earth, plants and fungi both send root-like structures through the ground. And the plants and the fungi can actually sense chemical signals from each other. And then that can then cause changes to their growth patterns and where they tend to grow towards and things like that. So to a certain extent, forests on Earth actually do have this sort of, it's not a mind, but it's a sort of a distributed communication network between the plants and the fungi across a wide area.
The mycorrhizal network. Yep. Mm-hmm. It's that is what the Avatar, and then I like how they tried to incorporate some bioluminescence in there too. That's always fun to see. You don't see bioluminescence in tetrapods, generally speaking. It's something that you
as far as I know, there are no bioluminescent tetrapods. There are bioluminescent vertebrates, right? There are plenty of bioluminescent fish in the ocean. There are even bioluminescent sharks. But yeah, no tetrapods. I don't know that anything like physically prevents tetrapods from being bioluminescent.
Especially because you could incorporate like a bioluminescent bacteria into your system without actually having to produce any bioluminescence yourself, right? There's organisms that do that. It's plenty of deep sea organisms that do that. But I don't know if they ever explain the bioluminescence on Pandora.
So one of the things is that's one of the areas of Pandora where it's hard to explain what the point of it is. Now, the real point of it, of course, is to make Pandora look fantastical and inviting at the same time. Right. That's the real reason it's there. Now, as far as an in-universe reason, you could say, well, maybe communication. And yeah, maybe. Although that begs the question then of why is there like moss that glows when you step on it? Like, who's that communicating to? What use is that moss getting out of the bioluminescence? I don't know. But it's also the case that, bioluminescence isn't restricted to the ocean. There are bioluminescent insects all over the place. If you've ever looked at fireflies, those are bioluminescent insects. Glowworms are a common kind of bioluminescent larval insect that exist in caves. But the thing that you see, what's the commonality in all these places? They're otherwise dark environments. Fireflies aren't lighting up at noon. They're lighting up at night. Glowworms are living in caves. Deep sea fish with significant bioluminescence are below the photic zone, where pretty much the only light there is from other bioluminescent organisms. And so I would say if you want to do a speculative evolution project that features a lot of bioluminescence and you want it to be realistic, you probably want it to be a dark environment. So for instance, if you were doing like we talked about earlier, where you have a tidally locked planet around a red dwarf star. Well, maybe as you get towards the night side of the planet, but it's still not in the freezing zone where basically life is just impossible because it's too cold. Maybe that would be a good place for bioluminescence because there's a lot less light there. And what heat you have is being brought in by the winds that are coming from the sun side.
So we actually have a question about the bioluminescence now coming because the algae, I guess, that washes up on the shore. When you step on it, it lights up.
Is this the one?
Yeah. So you can also get that effect in certain parts of the ocean just by turning propellers, where it breaks up some of this algae. And so there's a few hypotheses about this. One of the ones that I like is that this bioluminescence is actually possibly coincidental. Because if you notice, in like a steady state, there's not a whole lot of bioluminescence happening, right? If you just leave the algae on their own, they're not doing a lot of it. So one possibility is that this is something that's a byproduct of essentially some kind of traumatic incident happening to the algae, like being broken up from their various strings. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't actually know for certain what the reason for that is, but it is an interesting phenomenon. But also, I will also note that it is also primarily only prominent at night. So if you're still doing your own speculative evolution, you want some bioluminescent waves or footprints on the beach, still have it come out at night.
Marina's got some predatory ideas about why that algae's lighting up.
Oh,
so that the predators can locate you and then it can feed on your blood.
That seems like a detrimental thing.
Well, I've heard speculation that bramble, the way that it grabs sheep, is actually predatory because then the sheep die because they get stuck in the bramble, and then when they decay, it feeds the plant.
Yeah, I would call that predatory.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, plants actually are. There's a fair few predatory plants, and there are multiple different ways that plants have become predatory. So, for instance, you have things like, say, a bramble, which just physically ensnares things by being tough to get out of. Okay. You also have things like honeydew plants that will trap small animals by enfolding strands onto them that end in little sticky globs that they can't get out of.
And they curl up. They curl up on you. Yeah. There's a aquatic one that's what is it called? Something wort. I can't remember the name of it. It's got like a little spinner suction trap that uses the hydraulics to suck its prey in. And then obviously the quintessential predatory plant is the Venus flytrap, right?
Mm-hmm.
But pitcher plants are probably the most numerous, though. I'd say pitfall or pit trap plants.
Yeah.
The most variety.
That just has a soup of digestive enzymes and water at the bottom, and then it's hard to just crawl out of. And usually there's some kind of smell associated with them that attracts whatever prey insect. We also have things like Venus flytraps that have little sensor hairs, and when enough of them are triggered, a change in water pressure actually closes this open leaf with little hairs at the fringes onto itself, and then digestive enzymes will be excreted into that. So yeah, there's a whole lot.
Don't they end up dying after one time? Or
Yeah, the leaf will die back. The leaves it's just leaves. They're literally just leaves closing on. And sometimes if you put something big enough in there, they'll leave it drool. You'll see like a drip of the digestive enzymes.
So I didn't know that those were actually leaves. That's interesting.
Yep.
And evolutionarily, Venus flytraps have the tall stem to keep them from eating their pollinators.
That's cool. Well, we have about 9 minutes left. So is there something that maybe you want to share with us to kind of tie it all together? And then we would love to hear what you have coming up on your schedule.
Yeah, so I would say if you're interested in this, take a look at some of the other speculative evolution projects that we haven't really talked on, especially some of the really big ones. It'll be relatively easy to find. So there's the book Expedition by Wayne Barlow, which describes an alien planet. You can also get I believe it was Discovery Channel made a mostly CGI, like mockumentary style, not mockumentary in the comedic sense, but like sort of a faux documentary style about a actual human mission to this planet called Darwin 4. Check out The Future is Wild if you haven't already. I would recommend.
Which one has Wallace 5? What is that?
Wallace 5 is oh yeah, now I don't remember.
I made it slip out of your brain. I'm sorry.
You did. Maybe check out what is it? The Altamara's book is a fun one. So that is C.S. Cozeman, I believe, and that had a wild upsurge in popularity on YouTube last year, I believe. Check that out. Check out the Snouters. Check out some of these things. There's also a whole bunch of projects on YouTube, some of which are more or less active. Serina, Serina, is a fun project that you can find online with some really cool, it's a very cool art style, and it takes place on this moon of a gas giant where basically one tetrapod species was seeded, and that was a finch. And so all the tetrapods on the planet, which are the dominant, megafauna of the planet, are all derived finches, and in some cases extremely derived finches. So yeah, check that out. As far as what I'm doing coming up here, let's see. I just had a premiere today on Saturday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. I am planning a stream where I'm going to be covering a creationist talk. Basically, Genesis Apologetics had a big convention, and they produced like 4 hours worth of speaker content. And so I'm going through it. Of course, be Genesis Apologetics, which is sort of like the lowest rung of creationist organization that still actually can pull together a conference. The only people that could get to join them were the Institute for Creation Research, which is so bad even Ken Ham thinks they're dumb. But
yeah.
Dang.
Yeah. When Ken Ham is like, yeah, you guys that's dumb. Like that says something.
Oh my goodness.
So that's on the 29th. On the 2nd, I'm going to be doing my typical first Tuesday of the month show, which is called Kent with Bent, where I get booze and I sit around with my friend Bent while we correct Kent Hovind, and it drives me to drink because it's correcting Kent Hovind. So yeah, that's going to be at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. So yeah, and then I'll just go 1 week ahead. So on the 4th, I will be premiering at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, a supercut of a series that I did in which some guys from the Institute for Creation Research are going to sit around and mostly say absurdly stupid things about dinosaurs that just aren't true. and then I'm going to correct them for like 2.5 full hours.
Those are some of the fun ones that you do. I really enjoyed that. I also really quickly enjoyed your modern day debates, and I'm trying to think of what that guy's name is. He has like all these degrees, and he's a young Earth creationist.
So I did I did a debate with Sal Cordova.
That's it. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sal. So look, I overall I like Sal. I've hung out with Sal outside of like shows. Like there have been times where I'm just gonna call up Sal. We're both friends with Cindy Lincoln, who is Ken Hoven's ex-wife, or one of his ex-wives. Sorry.
Wow.
Yeah, he's got a fair few. He's the one, or she's the one that he was convicted of assaulting.
Okay, I know who you're talking about.
Yep. But right now, Sal's a bit angry at me because my most recent video series is about his mentor / friend / business partner. And I was not kind to that man, but I think deservedly so. And so chances are that sometime next week, I will upload my response to his response, which is mostly a lack of response because he has admitted to not watching the series, despite making a response video to my series, which hasn't even finished yet. So it's a very strange situation. But if you want to see other debates of mine from Modern Day Debate, I do have them on my channel if you don't want to see them on Modern Day Debate, or if you just want to give me the watch hours. I've debated some dinosaur deniers. I debated Mr. Batman on whether or not birds are dinosaurs. I also debated in a 2-on-2 some flat earthers, as well as 1-on-1 with Flat Earth Ozzy Roscoe, also known as Flat Earth Ozzy Jesus, in which I took the position that, in fact, the Earth is flat, but that the center around which the stars and the sun rotate is the South Pole, with Antarctica in the middle, because that better actually fits what he would see if he looked up into the sky where he is. And I tried to get him to tell me why my model was ridiculous, but his wasn't. He failed miserably at that. All he could do was make fun of the model, which is great because it's just the mirror image of his model. It's not any better.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Brilliant. I have to watch that one. Mm-hmm. I'll have to watch that. That was fantastic. Another one that I watched of you that had me laughing, it happened to be on some creationists who were talking nonsense about dinosaurs. And you were getting very frustrated. I think it was the way that they were way that they were describing the hip joints or something, the sockets.
Oh yeah. So real quick, I can explain that pretty quickly. So there's this thing called the acetabulum, right? It's where your hip actually joins in, or your femur, your upper leg bone actually joins into the hip. In essentially everything, humans included, it's this cup of bone, which is actually why it's called an acetabulum. That's Latin for a little cup that you put vinegar in so you can dip your food into some vinegar. And so because it looked like a little vinegar cup, that's what it's called. But in dinosaurs, that's actually just a ring of bone. There's no cup to it. It's open. Like if you had a dinosaur hip, you could just look through it. And for some reason, creationists just love to pretend that birds have a closed acetabulum that looks like a cup, even though they don't. And the thing is, all you have to do is just go look at a bird pelvis, right? Like you don't have to do anything complicated. You can find an anatomical reference or just go to any place that has a bird skeleton, which many museums do, and you can just check. And for some reason, creationists love to just lie about it. And it's very frustrating.
They don't expect to be fact-checked.
Well, yeah, it's not like one of those things that was like, oh, I think there's this genetic entropy and you have to know all this complicated population genetics and evolutionary biology stuff to actually really dig into why that's dumb. This is something that's like it's just as dumb as saying like, oh well, mammals all have 6 limbs. Like, no, you just look at it. That's all you have. It's all you have to do. You just look at it and you're like, nope, that's wrong. And yet they still keep saying it. It's very frustrating for me.
I can understand that. He was kind of stuttering a little bit while he was saying it. There was 2 guys talking, and anyway, I really enjoyed that video. So y'all need to go check out his stuff. We have where you can find him. It's in the description. The links are in the description, and we really want you to check him out. He does some great content. And Bre, you're wonderful. I just loved watching you have this conversation back and forth with him. So I'm so glad that just recently, Bre has joined on as my co-host, and I'm just so thrilled because she's just fantastic, and
Yeah,
I'm just
I get to
really
bring
grateful
on
for her all the time.
I get to bring cool people like Dapper here, who hasn't got a chance to have their voice heard over here at Skeptic Haven, and see what our communities. They have all sorts of, the skeptic community has all sorts of types of creators to offer, and I think what Dapper has to offer is unique, because he mixes doing his again, speculative evolution stuff like that, so he's really knowledgeable about the ecologies and stuff like that, and he mixes that with debunking young earth creationism, and that's something that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you for coming on here and sharing some of your brilliance with us
Well,
Yeah.
thank you
tonight.
for having me.
Absolutely. And if you guys like this content, please make sure and hit the like button. That really helps us to get more views. Subscribe, hit the bell, all those good things. If you really want to help us, you can become a patron. And let's see, let me get my list of patrons up. We have Eric Ozols, Tara S., Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dan D., Michael Wiseman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and me, of course. We also have other shows. Bumble Bre, do you want to talk about the other shows we have on our show on Skeptic Haven?
Yeah, do I have a list somewhere of that?
I am so sorry. I will go ahead and do that one, then I'll share the list with you. I apologize for that.
Yeah, no worries.
We have, let's see, we have Wednesday nights at the Secular Soapbox with Apostasy and Baphometal. We have, of course, Thursday nights here with Sunny Shell and Bumble Bre. Saturdays, we have the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload with all kinds of great hosts. And Sundays, we have our new call-in show, Let's Talk. So be sure and check out all of those great shows, Wednesday through Sunday. And check out this Sunday too. We have some really great shows coming up. All right. Until next time, everyone remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.
Night.